Anchorage, Alaska, September 30th, 2019. A woman walking through a residential street in Anchorage noticed a small plastic bag lying near the curb. It looked like something that had simply fallen from someone's pocket, the kind of thing most people would walk past without thinking. But when she picked it up, she saw something written across the outside in black marker. Homicide at Midtown Marriott. The words were oddly specific, too specific to ignore. Curious and a little unsettled, she took the card home and inserted it into her computer to see what was on it. A folder opened, containing dozens of files, photographs, and several short video clips. The first video showed the inside of a hotel room, a bed pushed against the wall, a small desk, the soft lighting typical of a business hotel. The camera moved slowly across the room, as if the person holding it was simply testing the device or recording the space. Then a woman appeared in the frame. She was sitting on the floor near the bed. A man was somewhere behind the camera, speaking to her. His voice sounded calm and conversational, almost casual, the kind of tone someone might use during an ordinary conversation. But as the video continued, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The woman seemed nervous. She tried to move away from the camera, keeping her distance from the person filming. The man continued speaking, sometimes addressing her directly, other times talking almost as if he were narrating what was happening. In the next clip, the situation had clearly escalated. The woman's voice could be heard pleading. She tried to resist as the man continued recording the entire encounter. At one point, he spoke quietly toward the camera and said, almost matter-of-factly, "Just die." The camera never turned away. In another recording, the woman was lying motionless on the floor while the man continued speaking in the room. Watching from her home computer, the woman who had found the memory card quickly realized she might be looking at something real. Not a staged video, not something meant for entertainment, but evidence of a murder. She stopped the playback and contacted the Anchorage Police Department. Detectives collected the microSD card and began reviewing the files themselves. In total, investigators found 39 photographs and 12 video recordings, all filmed inside the same hotel room over the course of 2 days, between September 4th and September 6th, 2019. Before long, they were able to identify the woman in the footage. Her name was Kathleen Jo Henry, a 30-year-old Alaska Native woman from the Yupik village of Eek, a small coastal community hundreds of miles west of Anchorage. By the time investigators examined the recordings, Henry had already been reported missing. The videos appeared to document the final hours of her life, but they also revealed something investigators rarely receive in a homicide investigation: the killer's own voice. Throughout the recordings, the man behind the camera spoke frequently, sometimes calmly, sometimes mocking the woman. The accent was noticeable, and it gave detectives an important starting point. Another clue came from the room itself. Investigators compared details in the videos: the furniture, the layout, the fixtures, with hotel interiors in Anchorage. Before long, they identified the location. Room 323 at the Town Place Suites by Marriott in Midtown Anchorage. Hotel records showed that the room had been rented during the exact dates the videos were recorded. The guest who checked in was a maintenance worker who occasionally stayed at the hotel using employee discounts. His name was Brian Stephen Smith. Smith had moved to Alaska from South Africa years earlier and had recently become a U.S. citizen. At work, co-workers described him as friendly and talkative, someone who joked with colleagues and rarely attracted attention. But when detectives compared Smith's voice to the one heard in the recordings, the similarity was hard to ignore. Then, 2 days after the memory card was discovered, another development changed the investigation. Along the Seward Highway south of Anchorage, authorities located human remains. The body was later identified as Kathleen Jo Henry. The footage on the memory card had captured the final hours before her death. On October 8, 2019, investigators arrested Brian Stephen Smith at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport after he returned from a trip out of state. At first, he denied everything, but the evidence was already waiting for him: his voice, the hotel records, and the recordings he had made himself. Eventually, Smith admitted he was the man behind the camera, but during questioning, detectives learned something even more disturbing. The murder of Kathleen Jo Henry might not have been the only crime he had committed. Smith began talking about another woman, a woman who had disappeared months earlier. Her name was Veronica Abuchuk, and suddenly, investigators realized something unsettling. The memory card found on that Anchorage street had not uncovered the beginning of the story, only the moment where the killer made a mistake. Because in the next cases, the evidence wasn't left in the open. It stayed hidden, locked away on forgotten hard drives, waiting for someone, anyone, to plug them in. Daniel Mercer, Mesa, Arizona, March 14, 2019. A reseller named Kevin Hargrove arrives at a storage facility in Mesa, Arizona. He does this often. When renters stop paying their monthly fees, the facility eventually auctions off the abandoned units. Buyers show up hoping to find something valuable inside: furniture, tools, electronics that can be resold. Most of the time, the units contain nothing remarkable: old clothes, boxes of papers, broken appliances. Unit B17 doesn't look much different. Inside are a few ordinary items: a desk, several cardboard boxes, and some outdated computer equipment covered in dust. At first, nothing stands out. Hargrove begins sorting through the contents, deciding what might still be useful. When he pulls open the desk drawer, he notices something unusual. Underneath the drawer, taped to the wood with thick gray duct tape, are 3 external hard drives. The placement feels deliberate, like someone wanted them hidden. Curious, Hargrove takes the drives home and connects one of them to his laptop. A folder opens. Inside are hundreds of short video files. Most of them appear to be filmed outdoors: parking garages, apartment complexes, bus stops, the entrance to a grocery store. The camera always stays at a distance, recording quietly from across the street or from inside a parked car. At first, the clips seem random, just fragments of everyday life. But after watching several of them, a pattern begins to appear. The same people keep showing up. 4 women. Each video captures small pieces of their daily routines. One woman leaving her apartment building in the morning. Another walking through the same parking garage after work. Someone entering a grocery store. Someone waiting at a bus stop. Some of the clips are recorded days apart. Others, weeks. The camera always watching from somewhere nearby, following, documenting. By the time Hargrove finishes reviewing the files, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Whoever recorded these videos had been tracking these women, systematically, carefully, for months. Hargrove contacts the police. Detectives from the Mesa Police Department's Digital Forensics Unit begin analyzing the drives. The files were recorded between August 2018 and January 2019. 2 of the women appearing most often in the videos are later identified as Emily Carter, 29, and Natalie Briggs, 32. Both women had already been reported missing earlier that year. Investigators begin tracing the storage unit itself. Rental records show the unit had been leased under the name Daniel Mercer. But when detectives review the paperwork, they discover the identification used to open the account was fraudulent. The name leads nowhere. No records, no driver's license, no real person connected to it. Digital analysts examine the video files for metadata, camera models, timestamps, GPS information, anything that might identify the person behind the recordings. But the files reveal almost nothing. The drives contain hundreds of clips, months of surveillance, evidence that someone had been studying these women's lives in careful detail. Yet the person who recorded them left behind almost no trace. Despite reviewing surveillance cameras at the storage facility and examining the rental documents, investigators are never able to determine who rented Unit B17. The name Daniel Mercer disappears into the investigation like it never existed, and the person who recorded the videos is never identified. To this day, the Mercer case remains unsolved, which means somewhere, someone spent months documenting the movements of 4 women, then vanished without a name. Because sometimes the evidence isn't hidden in a storage unit at all. Sometimes it's already out there, circulating quietly across the internet. A single image investigators couldn't explain. The face in the photograph had been twisted into a spiral, distorted so completely that no one could tell who the man was. For a while, it seemed impossible to identify him. But someone, somewhere, believed the distortion might not be permanent. And if that was true, the real face behind the image was still there, waiting to be uncovered. Christopher Paul Neal. In 2007, investigators working with international cybercrime units began examining a collection of disturbing images circulating online. The files had been recovered during several investigations into illegal content being shared across internet forums and private networks. At first, the images seemed like many others that investigators had already encountered. Disturbing, difficult to trace, and often stripped of the information that might reveal where they had been taken. But one photograph stood out. In the image, a man appeared in the background. His face had been deliberately altered. Instead of recognizable features, the center of the photograph showed a strange spiral distortion, a swirling pattern that twisted the man's face into an unrecognizable blur. The effect warped his eyes, his nose, his mouth, pulling them inward as if the image had been dragged into a vortex. Whoever created the distortion had clearly done it on purpose. The technique was simple but effective. With the swirl applied, the man's identity was impossible to determine. Investigators could see that he was there, but they couldn't see who he was. For months, the image circulated privately among law enforcement agencies as analysts attempted to identify where the photograph had been taken or who the man might be. But the distortion held. The face remained hidden. Eventually, investigators made an unusual decision. Instead of keeping the image inside police databases, they released it publicly. In July 2007, Interpol distributed the distorted photograph to media organizations around the world, asking for help identifying the man behind the swirl. The image quickly spread across news broadcasts, websites, and online forums. At first, most people simply stared at the strange photograph, unsure what they were looking at. A face was clearly there, but it was buried beneath the spiral. Then something unexpected happened. Internet users began trying to undo the distortion. Graphic designers, hobbyists, and digital analysts downloaded the image and began experimenting with the same tools that had likely been used to create it. They studied the spiral pattern, trying to determine how it had been applied and whether it could be reversed. Slowly, fragments of the original face began to reappear. Eyes, a nose, the outline of a jaw. The reconstruction wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Enough for someone to recognize the man. The name that eventually reached investigators was Christopher Paul Neal. Neal was a Canadian citizen who had spent years traveling and working overseas as an English teacher in several countries across Asia. By the time his identity was confirmed, he had already left Canada and was living abroad. Interpol issued an international arrest warrant. Authorities tracked Neal to Thailand, where local police located and arrested him in October 2007. The distorted photograph that had once hidden his identity had ultimately become the very thing that exposed him. What began as a single manipulated image had turned into one of the most recognizable digital investigations of its time. But the next case investigators would uncover didn't begin with an image on the internet. It began inside a motel room where a laptop had been left behind, and the recordings on it suggested that someone had been watching people much closer than anyone realized. Victor Langford, Gallup, New Mexico. On the morning of July 22, 2018, a housekeeper at the Desert Canyon Motel in Gallup, New Mexico began cleaning room 214. The guest who had rented the room the night before had checked out unexpectedly during the night. It wasn't unusual. Travelers passing through the area often arrived late and left before sunrise, continuing west toward Arizona or east across New Mexico's long desert highways. The room looked mostly normal. The bed was unmade. A few disposable cups sat on the desk. Nothing appeared broken or damaged. But when the housekeeper opened the nightstand drawer beside the bed, she found something that hadn't been there before. A laptop. It was tucked neatly inside the drawer, closed and unplugged. At first, it seemed like something a guest had simply forgotten. The motel manager turned it on, hoping to find a name or contact information that would help return it to its owner. Instead, the screen opened to a folder containing dozens of video files. Curious and slightly confused, the manager opened one of them. The footage showed a motel room, a room that looked very similar to the one they were standing in. The camera was positioned high near the ceiling, angled downward toward the bed. At first, nothing happened. Then a couple entered the room. They set down their bags, turned on the lights, and began unpacking. Neither of them looked toward the ceiling. Neither of them realized they were being filmed. The video continued for several minutes. The camera never moved. It had been placed somewhere fixed, hidden. The manager opened another video, then another. Each clip showed a different room, different guests, some arriving late at night, some leaving early in the morning, all of them unaware that a camera was quietly recording from somewhere inside the room. Concerned by what he was seeing, the manager contacted the Gallup Police Department. Detectives soon discovered that the laptop contained dozens of recordings, and the angles of the footage revealed something important. The cameras weren't handheld. They were hidden inside the rooms themselves. Small cameras concealed inside smoke detectors and electrical outlets, positioned high enough that most guests would never notice them. Digital forensic analysts examined the files and discovered the recordings had not all been captured in the same location. Several clips came from the Desert Canyon Motel, but others appeared to come from different properties. Motels in Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada. Investigators began checking maintenance records at these locations, and eventually, a name appeared repeatedly. A contract maintenance technician who had worked on electrical fixtures in several of the same motels where the recordings had been captured. His name was Victor Langford. Langford had been hired periodically to repair outlets, install wiring, and replace smoke detectors. Jobs that gave him access to nearly every room in the buildings. When police attempted to locate him, they discovered something strange. Langford had already left his last known address in Flagstaff, Arizona weeks earlier. Neighbors reported that he had packed his belongings quickly and moved out without explanation. No forwarding address, no contact information, just gone. Police inspected the motels where Langford had worked. Inside several smoke detectors, investigators discovered miniature cameras hidden behind the plastic casings. Some were connected to small storage devices. Others appeared to have transmitted recordings wirelessly. Guests who had stayed in those rooms had no idea they had been filmed. And by the time the laptop was discovered, the man believed to have installed the cameras had already disappeared. Victor Langford was never located. His current whereabouts remain unknown, which means somewhere there may still be more recordings, more cameras, still hidden inside places people assume are private. But the next discovery wouldn't come from a motel room. It would come from deep inside a forest. After a wildfire burned a remote cabin to the ground, and firefighters found something unusual buried beneath the floor. Adrian Keller, Bitterroot National Forest, Montana. September 3rd, 2021. Firefighters were battling a wildfire burning through a remote section of the Bitterroot National Forest in western Montana. The blaze had already consumed thousands of acres of dry timber, moving quickly through the mountains as crews worked to contain it. After the flames passed through one isolated area, firefighters moved in to inspect what remained. Among the burned trees and ash-covered ground, they found the remains of a small cabin. The structure had been almost completely destroyed by the fire. Only parts of the foundation and a few sections of collapsed flooring were still visible beneath the debris. While searching the site for hazardous materials, one of the firefighters noticed something unusual beneath the charred floorboards, a small metal safe. It had been partially buried under the remains of the cabin, protected from the worst of the heat by the collapsed structure above it. The safe was removed from the site and turned over to investigators with the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office. When detectives opened it, they found only one item inside, an external hard drive. The casing had been damaged by heat and smoke, but the drive itself had been stored inside a padded container, which appeared to have protected the internal components. The device was sent to the Montana State Crime Lab, where forensic technicians attempted to recover whatever data might still remain on it. After several days of work, they were able to extract a number of video files. Each recording appeared to take place inside the same cabin that had burned down in the forest. The camera was always positioned in the same spot, facing a wooden table. One by one, different people appeared in front of the camera. Each person sat down at the table and began speaking. Some introduced themselves by first name. Others didn't give a name at all. But the pattern in the recordings was always the same. They spoke directly to the camera. and they described crimes they claimed to have committed. The confessions varied. Some spoke about theft, others about assaults. A few described acts that investigators could not easily verify. At first, it almost looked like a strange collection of recorded testimonies. But as analysts reviewed the videos more closely, something about the recordings began to feel wrong. Many of the people sitting at the table looked nervous. Several avoided looking directly into the camera. Instead, their eyes kept drifting somewhere just behind it, towards someone standing in the room. In one recording, a man pauses in the middle of speaking and glances over the camera's edge before continuing. In another, a woman's voice shakes slightly as she continues her story, her eyes repeatedly shifting toward the same unseen point in the room. It slowly became clear that whoever was filming these confessions had likely been standing just out of frame, watching. Investigators attempted to identify the people appearing in the recordings. They ran facial comparisons through law enforcement databases. They checked missing persons reports across multiple states, but none of the faces produced confirmed matches. The property where the cabin once stood had been rented under the name Adrian Keller, but like several other cases investigators had seen before, the identification used for the rental agreement turned out to be fraudulent. No verifiable records, no confirmed identity, just a name written on paperwork. Detectives searched nearby towns, hoping someone might remember the person who had lived in the remote cabin before the fire. But no one could provide a clear description. Whoever Adrian Keller really was, he had disappeared long before the wildfire ever reached the cabin, leaving behind only a burned structure, a locked safe, and a hard drive filled with recorded confessions from people investigators still cannot identify. To this day, the purpose of those recordings remains unknown. But the next discovery investigators would examine didn't come from a forest fire. It came from something far older. A small computer disk mailed to a television station. And the person who sent it had been hiding in plain sight for more than 30 years. Dennis Rader, Wichita, Kansas, February 2005. For more than 30 years, the killer known as BTK had remained a ghost. The name came from the method he used in his crimes: bind, torture, kill. Beginning in 1974, a series of murders in Wichita, Kansas terrified the city. Entire families were attacked inside their own homes. The killer left behind carefully written letters describing the crimes, sometimes sending them to newspapers or police. Then, for years at a time, he disappeared. No witnesses, no clear suspect, only occasional messages sent to authorities, taunting them, reminding them that he was still out there. By the early 2000s, many investigators believed the killer had either died or stopped. Then, in 2004, the letters started again. Packages began arriving at media outlets and police departments in Wichita. Inside were documents, photographs, and messages signed with the same initials. BTK. The killer was communicating again. Each message appeared carefully prepared. The envelopes were anonymous. The documents contained no obvious fingerprints or clues. But during one exchange with investigators, the killer asked a question that would later become famous. He wanted to know whether a computer disk could be traced by police. Investigators responded through a newspaper message. They told him it could not. Months later, in February 2005, a floppy disk arrived at a local television station in Wichita. The disk contained a single file. On the surface, it appeared harmless, a short document containing another message from BTK. But investigators sent the disk to digital forensic specialists for examination. Inside the file, analysts discovered something the sender clearly hadn't expected. Metadata, hidden information automatically stored by the computer that had created the document. The data revealed that the file had been created by a user named Dennis. It also showed that the document had been edited on a computer registered to Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. Detectives began examining the church staff. One name stood out almost immediately: Dennis Rader. Rader was a longtime member of the church. He served as the congregation's president. In the community, he was known as a quiet, dependable man, a husband, a father, a local compliance officer who spent much of his time enforcing municipal codes, someone who had lived in Wichita for decades without drawing suspicion. But when investigators began reviewing his background more closely, the connections started to appear. Rader had lived near several of the early crime scenes. His writing style closely matched the letters sent by BTK. And now, the floppy disk had linked him directly to the messages. On February 25, 2005, police arrested Dennis Rader while he was driving near his home in Park City, Kansas. After decades of searching, the killer who had terrorized Wichita had finally been identified, not through DNA, not through a witness, but through a mistake on a computer disk, a piece of digital evidence he believed could never be traced. But the next case investigators would encounter wasn't uncovered through a floppy disk. It was found on a computer hard drive, inside a document that looked like fiction, a file titled simply SK Confessions. Mark Twitchell, Edmonton, Alberta, October 2008. Police began investigating the disappearance of a 38-year-old man named Johnny Altinger. Altinger had last been heard from in early October after telling friends he was meeting a woman he had met online. The woman's name, according to messages he had shown to friends, was Sheena. She had contacted him through a dating website. Their conversations had been brief, but she suggested they meet in person. On the evening of October 10th, Altinger drove across the city toward an industrial area where she said she lived. After that, he was never seen again. Days later, Altinger's friends received an unusual email from his account. The message claimed he had unexpectedly met someone else and decided to leave the country. It sounded strange, too sudden, too out of character. His friends contacted police. Investigators began examining the online account that had communicated with Altinger. The profile for Sheena quickly raised suspicions. The photos appeared generic. The account history was extremely short, and the IP address used to create it traced back to Edmonton. As detectives followed the digital trail, it eventually led them to a man named Mark Twitchell. Twitchell was a local filmmaker who had been renting a small garage in an industrial complex. He told people he was using the space to work on an independent horror film. When police searched the garage, they found something that made them uneasy. The interior had been carefully prepared. Plastic sheeting covered sections of the walls. Cleaning supplies and tools were scattered around the room, and there were traces of blood. But the most significant discovery came later, when investigators began examining Twitchell's computer. On the hard drive, they found a document with a strange title: SK Confessions. At first glance, the file appeared to be a piece of fiction. The document described a serial killer who lured victims through online dating profiles. The victims would arrive expecting to meet a woman. Instead, they would be attacked inside a prepared location. The story described the process in disturbing detail, creating fake profiles, arranging meetings, preparing the space, cleaning the scene afterward. The more detectives read, the more familiar the story became, because the events described in the document closely matched the circumstances surrounding Johnny Altinger's disappearance. Investigators soon realized something chilling. The document wasn't fiction, it was a record, a step-by-step account of a real crime. Later sections of the file described the killer reflecting on what had happened, analyzing mistakes, describing the aftermath, and considering how the process might be improved. The document read less like a story and more like a journal, one written by someone documenting his own actions. When confronted with the evidence, Twitchell attempted to claim the file was simply part of a screenplay. But the details inside the document matched the investigation too closely. The fake profile, the meeting, the garage, and the disappearance of Johnny Altinger. In 2011, Mark Twitchell was convicted of first-degree murder. The document discovered on his computer, the file titled SK Confessions, became one of the most important pieces of evidence presented during the trial. A digital confession hidden inside what looked like fiction.